Since Miss Hawthorne has never been educated, perhaps she may amuse us by guessing where a lady ought to sit," Octavia said, just as Gwendolyn exchanged 2 ivory place cards and took the empty chair no one had assigned her. Valentine, Duke of Edgemont, rose at her right, extended an open hand toward her, and said, "Then the evening is yours. Miss Hawthorne, seat us as you think best." Octavia's black fan snapped shut. "I invited a maid, your grace, not a mistress of ceremonies." One wrong laugh could still cost Gwendolyn her place in Octavia's household before the soup cooled. Gwendolyn kept one finger on the blue-edged card she had moved. In the hall she had heard the 2 gentlemen originally placed together trade 3 sharp remarks about erasing debt. They were now separated by half the table and speaking peaceably to other neighbors. "I cannot quote a rule for every chair, my lady," Gwendolyn said, "but I can tell you which 2 gentlemen will quarrel before the first course is cleared." A laugh escaped beyond the candelabra, not cruel this time. Valentine looked from the cards to the 2 quiet conversations. "Then I should be foolish to put them together merely because someone wrote their names beside one another. That is the first sensible thing anyone has said about the table." His mouth almost smiled. "Do continue." By dessert, no quarrel had broken out. Gwendolyn had moved a timid young lady away from a notorious gossip and left Valentine's own chair precisely where it was.
"And the wages are mine?"
"Yours."
As the company rose for the drawing room, he stopped beside her. "I have 3 receptions to give before the month is out. Remain Lady Ravenscroft's maid, if you prefer, or arrange the guest list seating and supper flow for all 3. You will be paid separately, and in those matters, your judgment will govern the pairings." Octavia gave a short, incredulous breath. Gwendolyn had no intention of accepting charity disguised as amusement. "All 3. On one condition. When the last is finished, I want a written reference for the work, whether or not your grace still enjoys being contradicted." "Agreed. And the wages are mine. Yours." That answer mattered. Gwendolyn opened the guest list. "Then we begin now." Valentine pointed to Lord Hatherley's name. "I would keep him in the principal supper room. He will insult 3 people before the fish. You cannot ban every difficult man in Brighton. I do not mean to ban him. Put him among the whist players after the first half hour. He behaves better when his hands are occupied. You will lose him the moment he leaves the table. Then let us keep score. If he causes a quarrel, you win. If he behaves, I win." Valentine regarded her as gravely as if she had proposed a treaty. "A wager, Miss Hawthorne. A professional one." "Of course." The dry amusement in his answer told her Thursday would be more interesting than she had expected. Thursday arrived with a flurry of calling cards and silk. Gwendolyn stood near the folding doors of the drawing room, watching the early arrivals. Her brown dress was freshly pressed, her position defined. She was not a guest, but she was no longer an invisible servant. Frederick Atherton, Octavia's nephew, was holding court near the fireplace. Frederick possessed a loud laugh and a habit of claiming intimate knowledge of every peer in Brighton. Gwendolyn watched as he began steering a painfully shy newcomer, Miss Elmsley, toward a tight circle of intimidating older matrons, believing it to be the most prestigious conversation. Valentine, standing across the room, caught Gwendolyn's eye. He gave a slight nod, preparing to cross the floor and smoothly redirect Frederick before the shy girl was swallowed alive. Gwendolyn shook her head slightly and moved first. She did not confront Frederick. Instead, she signaled a footman to carry a tray of particularly intricate iced cakes directly through the center of the room, forcing the intimidating matrons to step left and another group to step right. In the ensuing brief shuffle, Gwendolyn pleasantly intercepted. Miss Elmsley asked her a question regarding a dropped fan and seamlessly rotated her into a gentle conversation with 2 quiet, artistic ladies. Frederick, returning from the disruption, found himself stranded. He confidently joined the nearest group, laughing loudly at a comment only to realize he had inserted himself into a deeply serious political debate he knew nothing about. He reddened, stammering, as the gentleman stared at him. Valentine did not let the silence stretch into cruelty. He stepped forward instantly. "Atherton, just the man. I am in desperate need of a fourth for whist in the blue room, and I know your skill at the game. Will you rescue me?" Frederick seized the exit with visible relief. "Of course, Your Grace. Happy to oblige." As Frederick hurried away, Valentine caught Gwendolyn's gaze again. She had exposed the falsehood playfully. He had provided the dignified retreat. "You prefer to let them trip," Valentine murmured, pausing beside her as he adjusted a candelabra. "I prefer to see who they actually are," Gwendolyn replied softly. "You prefer to catch them before they hit the floor. A host's duty. A point to each of us, I think." Later that same evening, a recently widowed guest, Mrs. Higgins, made a remarkably awkward comment regarding the longevity of marriages. The immediate silence was sharp. Gwendolyn calculated a quick, distracting joke to break the ice and draw the attention onto herself. She took a breath to speak, but Valentine caught her eye and gave a nearly imperceptible shake of his head. He looked at the widow. The woman's hands trembled against her silk reticule, and her gaze kept slipping toward the doorway. Gwendolyn understood then that a joke would not help her. The widow wanted a way out without becoming the subject of the room. Valentine stepped forward. "Mrs. Higgins, I have just been informed the night air is turning damp, and I recall you mentioned your carriage horses are sensitive to the chill. I have taken the liberty of having it brought round early, should you wish to depart before the rain." Only then did Gwendolyn understand his method. He had not pretended the remark had never been made, and he had not turned the widow into an object of pity. He had simply placed a respectable reason for leaving within reach. Mrs. Higgins's fingers loosened on her reticule. "You are too kind, Your Grace. I believe I shall take my leave." To cover her departure without the room staring, Gwendolyn immediately turned to Frederick, who had re-emerged. "Mr. Atherton, I wager you cannot predict which of the 3 footmen will drop a glass tonight." 3 heads turned toward Frederick at once, then 5 more. Within seconds, the foolish wager had collected half the room. Mrs. Higgins slipped out while everyone argued over which footman looked least steady. A little later, carriage wheels crunched over the gravel outside. "Your method wins that round," Gwendolyn said to Valentine when they finally crossed paths near the supper room. "I would have made a spectacle of it. I concede the point." "We are tied, then," Valentine noted, his tone laced with dry amusement. "Only until tomorrow," Gwendolyn promised. "I shall beat you in your own kitchen next." Over the next 3 weeks, the rhythm of the house altered. Gwendolyn's work became a living engine within Edgemont House. The second reception was looming, and the preparations required constant coordination. On a busy Tuesday morning, Gwendolyn stood in the vast copper-hung kitchen. The arrival of tradesmen and early afternoon callers was causing the upstairs timetable to overlap dangerously with the downstairs deliveries. Gwendolyn had turned the chaotic timing into a game. "Listen," she told the head cook, raising a finger as a heavy tread sounded on the gravel outside. "That is Lord Stanhope's boot. It drags on the left. The front door will open in exactly 3 seconds." It did. The kitchen staff chuckled. Valentine walked through the service door a moment later, pausing at the sight of his paid companion holding court among the flour sacks. He did not reprimand the staff for laughing in his presence. "You believe you can identify anyone by their step, Miss Hawthorne?" Valentine asked, leaning slightly against the heavy wooden table. "I believe I can identify anyone who believes they own the floor they walk on, Your Grace," Gwendolyn teased. "I wager you cannot guess the next arrival." Valentine listened. A rapid light clicking of heels sounded on the stone steps outside the service entrance. Lady Millicent's maid returning with the ribbons. "Wrong," Gwendolyn declared cheerfully. "It is the baker's boy who wears boots 2 sizes too large and overcompensates by striking his heels." "Open the door, Thomas." A footman pulled the heavy oak door open. The baker's boy stood there, balancing a massive tray of tarts. The laughter died at once. No one seemed certain whether a duke would treat being made the loser of a kitchen wager as insolence. Valentine looked at the boy, then at Gwendolyn. He gave a slow, formal bow of his head. "I yield to superior local knowledge. The point is yours, Miss Hawthorne." For one suspended second, no one moved. Then the cook covered a smile with the back of her wrist. The scullery maid bent over a bowl she had no need to examine, and the baker's boy grinned openly. Valentine looked around the kitchen. "I believe I have been defeated before witnesses." That was enough. The laughter returned, not the sharp laughter of Octavia's dinner demanded from below and aimed downward, but the helpless kind that arrived when everyone had heard the same joke. Gwendolyn laughed with them. No one had asked her to be amusing. That was the difference. 3 days later, a sudden torrential downpour trapped 20 afternoon callers inside the house. The formal drawing room grew suffocatingly stiff as rank dictated. Who sat where, breaking the guests into hostile, silent little clusters. Rain lashed against the window panes. Gwendolyn noticed the shy Miss Elmsley, standing awkwardly near a velvet curtain, clearly wanting to join a card game, but lacking the courage to insert herself among the intimidating older peers. Valentine was already moving smoothly, breaking apart a tense political argument by suggesting they reform the card tables entirely, offering everyone a graceful route to move. As the guests shuffled, Gwendolyn stepped in. She gathered the scattered decks and with a swift, deliberate clumsiness, dropped a deck squarely onto the table in front of Miss Elmsley. "Oh, my apologies," Gwendolyn said brightly. "Miss Elmsley, since I have made a mess of the cards, would you be so kind as to deal the first hand? You may choose your partner as compensation for my clumsiness." Frederick Atherton caught the sleight of hand. "Foul play, Miss Hawthorne," he called out jokingly. "You dropped them on purpose. I am entirely innocent." Gwendolyn laughed, stepping back, because the cards had handed her an excuse stronger than rank. Miss Elmsley managed a nervous smile and chose a kind-faced older gentleman as her partner. The first hand began before anyone could reconsider. Later, when the rain softened to a steady tapping, Miss Elmsley found Gwendolyn near the window and held up 2 ribbons from a work basket. "Blue or cream?" Gwendolyn glanced at the girl's complexion. "Blue, unless you intend to spend the evening apologizing to the cream." Miss Elmsley laughed and chose the blue. The question lasted less than a minute, yet Gwendolyn carried it with her. The young lady had not called her over to fetch something. She had asked what Gwendolyn thought. The second grand reception proved the most logistically complex. A string quartet was hired to play in the music room. Octavia Ravenscroft, however, had issued a sharp directive. The heavy double doors leading to the service corridor must remain shut tight. "The staff are here to work, not to enjoy a concert." She had sniffed. Keeping the doors closed meant the footman had to navigate a perilous, narrow back route with heavy supper trays. Gwendolyn stared at the closed doors, her frustration mounting. She did not mean to turn a supper route into a grand quarrel over rank, but the rule was pointlessly cruel and practically disastrous. Valentine found her glaring at the brass handles. He assessed the problem. "My aunt prefers her hierarchies visible. Your aunt prefers people to be miserable if it proves she is in charge." Gwendolyn muttered. Valentine did not argue. Instead, he signaled 2 footmen. "Move the large embroidered screen 3 feet to the left. Angle the quartet's chairs slightly toward the hall." Once done, the musicians were shielded from direct view of the service doors. Valentine then reached out and pulled the heavy double doors wide open. The service line remains proper out of sight, but sound thankfully bends. The intricate strains of a Mozart piece spilled freely into the corridor. Gwendolyn immediately adapted the rhythm. She caught the eye of the head footman and raised a hand. "Move the trays only between the musical phrases," she instructed softly. "When the strings swell, we walk. When they drop, we wait." It became a silent, beautiful game. Trays wheeled smoothly through the passage. The staff heard the music. No one was made a spectacle. At the threshold, Valentine glanced back. Gwendolyn was still beside the open doors, one hand raised to hold the next tray until the violins lifted. His eyes met hers for a single beat, and the corner of his mouth moved before he turned away. No one else seemed to notice. As Valentine returned to the guests, Gwendolyn understood what pleased her most. He had used all his careful manners not merely to quiet the house, but to let the people working in it hear the music. Long after the last carriage had crunched away down the drive, the house fell into a heavy, wax-scented quiet. Servants moved through the rooms, snuffing candles. Gwendolyn stood near the mantelpiece in the dining room, exhausted. The work was done. There was no professional necessity to remain. Valentine entered, loosening his cravat by a fraction of an inch. "I counted correctly tonight," he said. "Lord Stanhope was offended exactly when I predicted. But Lady Clara laughed at the right moment." Gwendolyn counted, pulling a leftover ivory place card from her apron pocket. She retrieved a pencil from the mantel and made a tiny, deliberate mark on the card. "I read 4 guests correctly to your 3. I will not accept a diplomatic tie." Valentine stepped closer. The vast room felt suddenly very small. "I concede. You have the sharper eye." Gwendolyn slipped the marked ivory card into his discarded leather glove resting on the table. "Defeated by 1 chair, Your Grace." Valentine looked down at the glove, then up at her. The quiet between them felt unlike the pauses they spent measuring other people. "If there were no other guests in the room, Miss Hawthorne, what would you choose?" Gwendolyn did not retreat behind a joke. She reached out, grasped the back of a plain, unadorned side chair, and dragged it 2 inches closer to where he stood. "This one," she said quietly. Valentine's glance dropped to the 2 inches of polished floor she had claimed between their chairs, then returned to her face. He did not turn the moment into a compliment or an offer. For once, Gwendolyn found no joke she wished to use as cover. Neither of them moved the chair back. By the following morning, Octavia had noticed enough. The third and final reception, a grand masquerade, was drawing near. Octavia had stopped calling Gwendolyn's work a joke. She had begun appearing in doorways when guest lists were discussed, closing her fan whenever a visitor addressed Gwendolyn directly, and correcting servants who took Gwendolyn's instructions without first looking to her. On the morning of the formal dinner that preceded the masquerade, Gwendolyn watched Octavia shepherd 3 influential matrons into the morning room. Before the door closed, Octavia's voice carried into the hall. "If the girl appears upstairs tonight, we shall take our leave." When the matrons emerged, one of them said far too clearly, "We cannot be expected to dine under such an arrangement." Valentine was summoned to the library next. He came out 20 minutes later wearing the smooth, courteous expression. Gwendolyn had learned to distrust whenever too many people wanted incompatible things. She disliked the look of it before he ever spoke to her. When Gwendolyn entered the dining room to make the final checks that afternoon, Valentine was waiting. He looked unusually rigid. "The arrangements are perfect, Miss Hawthorne," Valentine said smoothly. "However, for this evening's dinner, I require you to remain below stairs. You will direct the flow from the kitchens. It will ensure the smoothest service." Gwendolyn stopped with one hand still resting on the back of a chair she had placed herself. She knew Octavia's methods too well to ask why. Every seat in the room had been arranged by her. Every servant below stairs had been given the order of service by her. Yet Valentine was asking her to make herself invisible so 3 women could enjoy the result without having to admit who had made it possible. Whatever kindness he imagined in the request, its price was simple. She disappeared, and everyone else remained comfortable. Her smile came too bright. "Of course, Your Grace, the kitchen is precisely where a joke belongs." She went below because the first course still had to be served, and work did not cease to matter merely because she was angry. By the time the soup left the kitchen, the order she had designed was running perfectly. Footmen passed through the service door at the intervals she had set. No tray collided, no guest waited. Gwendolyn stood at the foot of the service stair and listened to the muffled conversation above. That perfection was what stopped her. If she remained hidden, every guest would enjoy her judgment while pretending it had no owner. Octavia's first joke would harden into a rule Gwendolyn might be useful, provided no one had to look at her. The second service bell sounded. Gwendolyn took a wine glass from the tray beside her and climbed the stairs. Halfway through the dinner, as the soup was cleared, she walked straight through the main doors. A fork struck a plate and stopped. Octavia went rigid. Frederick Atherton, sitting near the center, looked horrified. Gwendolyn raised the glass, her smile blindingly bright and entirely false. "A toast," she announced, her voice ringing off the crystal. "To every guest fortunate enough to have been invited sincerely, and to those who must threaten their host to secure their seat." She set the glass down with a sharp clink and turned on her heel. Frederick, who had been laughing along out of nervousness, suddenly found himself the target of Octavia's immediate vicious wrath. "You find this amusing, Frederick?" the Dowager spat. The table erupted into a chaotic, venomous family quarrel. Gwendolyn reached the service stairs with her breath coming too fast. "You find this amusing, Frederick?" His answer was lost beneath the scrape of a chair, but the sound struck Gwendolyn harder than Octavia's insult had. She had wanted to wound the women who had demanded her absence. Instead, she had thrown Frederick into the quarrel because he happened to be sitting close enough to catch the flame. Her hand closed around the banister. Running would leave that damage to everyone else.
"Those who prefer not to dine under that condition may, of course, have their carriages."
Before Gwendolyn had taken 3 steps downward, Valentine's voice carried through the open doorway behind her. It was not loud. That made every syllable clearer. "Lady Ravenscroft, I made the arrangement by which Miss Hawthorne was asked to remain below. I withdraw it." The dining room quieted by degrees. "Miss Hawthorne decides whether she is visible in the work she was hired to perform in my house," he continued. "Those who prefer not to dine under that condition may of course have their carriages." Octavia's answer came sharp enough to reach the stair. "You would insult your own blood for a—" "I would prefer the carriage orders given quietly," Valentine said, still courteous, "so the guests who remain may finish their dinner in peace." 2 of the matrons stood and left. The third remained long enough to finish her wine, then departed without taking coffee. Gwendolyn stayed on the stair until footsteps approached the hall. She could not leave the damage behind her. She turned around and walked back up. She did not re-enter the dining room, but waited until Frederick Atherton emerged, looking pale and thoroughly rattled. "Mr. Atherton," Gwendolyn said, her voice stripped of all humor. "I made you part of my joke without asking your permission. It was cruel, and it was mine to mend. I apologize." Frederick stopped, surprised. "It was a sharper joke than you meant, Miss Hawthorne," he said quietly, "but accepted." The next morning, 2 acceptances for the masquerade were withdrawn. Valentine did not ask Gwendolyn to soften her position in exchange for winning either household back. 2 days later, the masquerade preparations filled every passage with flowers, silver-folded linen, and servants hurrying past one another with armfuls of work. Octavia had lost the dinner argument, not her appetite for control. Twice before noon, she altered a footman's instructions. Once she sent a maid to move a supper cloth Gwendolyn had already measured for another table. Gwendolyn could have invented some elaborate errand to keep her occupied. She did not. Gwendolyn found Valentine in the library with the final guest list open before him. She shut the door only far enough to keep the corridor noise from swallowing her words. "Keep Lady Ravenscroft out of the staff passage between 5 and 9, Gwendolyn said. "I cannot keep the supper service straight if she is changing my orders. The rest is mine." Valentine did not add to the request, or turn it into an offer to manage the evening for her. "Between 5 and 9, he said. "The passage is yours. The passage is the staff's. I merely need her out of it." A flicker of amusement touched his mouth. "Then I shall keep her occupied with hothouse flowers' linen inspections and my aunt's opinions in that order." At 6 o'clock, Octavia attempted to breach the green baize door leading to the kitchens, claiming she needed to inspect the supper linen. Valentine intercepted her in the hall. He was impeccably polite, offering his arm and smoothly steering her toward the floral arrangements in the music room. 20 minutes later, Gwendolyn heard Octavia's voice rise on the other side of the green baize door. "I only wish to inspect the supper linen. And I am in desperate need of your opinion on the hothouse flowers," Valentine answered. The voices moved away together. Gwendolyn had a ridiculous urge to open the door and make certain he had truly carried Octavia with him. Instead, she counted the next stack of plates, corrected the order of 2 trays, and kept working. The sound of his conversation faded toward the music room. She let it. When the final silver trays were polished and the ballroom doors were ready to be opened, Gwendolyn found Valentine standing near the musicians' gallery. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax and cut flowers. She walked up to him and placed a single blank place card onto the small table beside him. "After the last guest is seated for supper," she said, looking straight at him. "Save me 1 dance." Valentine looked at the blank card, a slow warmth spreading in his eyes. "Does this count toward our score, Miss Hawthorne?" "No," Gwendolyn said softly. "It is not work." The masquerade began beneath a drift of candlelight and black, silver, and blue masks. Octavia changed tactics. If she could no longer order Gwendolyn out of the working passages, she would make the guests themselves question why a maid had any place upstairs. As the first guests arrived, a whisper began to snake through the dominoes and half-masks. 3 evenings of carrying lists beside a duke and the maid has begun to think herself a lady. She contrived the whole arrangement to place herself at his Grace's side. Give a servant authority over a few chairs, and she will soon mistake employment for admission. The rumor reached Gwendolyn while she was checking the card room. Her first thought was so absurd she nearly laughed. Find the most outrageous jester's mask in the house, march into the ballroom, and ask which lady feared losing her rank because a maid had moved a chair. The idea was bright, vicious, and very nearly irresistible. Then Frederick's pale face at the dinner returned to her. A public stunt would not strike only Octavia. It would pull the footmen, the musicians, and anyone foolish enough to laugh into the quarrel with her. Gwendolyn let the imagined joke die before it reached her mouth. She found Valentine near the main doors. He had heard the whispers. That much was plain from the way 3 guests had just stepped away from him with careful faces. "If you wished to wait until—" he began. Then he stopped. Gwendolyn saw the old compromise form and die before it reached the end of the sentence. Before he could speak again, Gwendolyn stepped into his path. "Control the exits," she told him. "Keep Octavia from reaching the staff passage. I will decide when to unmask, and I will decide what to do with the room." Valentine held her gaze for a moment. "The doors are mine," he said. "Your entrance is yours." At the far end of the ballroom, Octavia had collected the remaining matrons and several uncertain guests into one glittering knot. Cloaks had already been sent for. If they all departed together at the supper bell, the gesture would say more than any whispered accusation could. Valentine began with the room, not with Octavia. He opened the double doors to the card room and the terrace, giving anyone who wished to withdraw a respectable reason to do so, without joining a procession of outrage. He quietly ordered the carriages brought round for those who had already asked. Then he intercepted a wavering Lord Linfield near the hearth. "The carriages are ready for anyone who requires them," Valentine said. "And the Edgemont table remains open to every guest who wishes to stay and enjoy the supper." That was all. No demand for loyalty, no denunciation. A guest could stay because a host had offered supper, not because he or she had chosen a side in Octavia's quarrel. Frederick, standing near his aunt, removed his mask and asked a footman for wine. One gentleman who had been waiting for his wife's cloak changed his mind and sent it back. Another matron accepted a seat in the card-room instead of ordering her carriage. The departure Octavia had meant to make grand became 3 separate decisions made at 3 different doors. The orchestra never stopped playing. The supper bell chimed. Gwendolyn entered the room. She wore her simple brown dress and a plain black silk half-mask. She did not skulk along the walls, nor did she stride to the center as if demanding a triumph. She walked to the supper table where the final seating list lay. Conversation thinned as she passed. By the time she reached the table, Gwendolyn could hear the hearth and the faint scrape of a violinist settling his bow in the next room. She reached up and untied the ribbon of her mask, letting it fall. Then she withdrew the original ivory place card from her first night, the scalloped one with the blue edge, and placed it blank side up on the mahogany. "I was brought to one table in this house as a joke," Gwendolyn said, looking directly at Octavia before letting her gaze travel across the guests. "I was paid wages to arrange the next 3. I have claimed no title, only the work I did and the right to choose my own chair." She did not wait for applause or a verdict. She passed the grand center chair and took a plain side seat halfway down the right side. Then she gestured to Frederick Atherton, who was standing nearby. "Mr. Atherton, do take the center seat. You look as though you need the legroom." Frederick let out a startled laugh. This time Gwendolyn knew exactly whom the joke belonged to. He bowed deeply and took the grand chair. One of Octavia's matrons gave Frederick a look of exhausted disbelief. Then, when he grinned at her from the grand chair, the corner of her mouth betrayed the beginning of a smile before she looked away. A lady 2 places down smiled and moved to the seat Gwendolyn indicated. Another guest followed. No one applauded. They simply began to sit, and the ordinary business of supper resumed around the choice Octavia had tried to turn into a scandal. Gwendolyn laid both hands briefly in her lap until her pulse steadied.
Breakfast. You may choose a chair, if you are brave enough to lose another argument.
Hours later, the last carriage departed. The supper room was emptied of guests, the long table cluttered with half-empty glasses and crumpled napkins. Valentine found Gwendolyn standing by the sideboard. The 3 receptions were finished. Her wages and the promised reference were hers, whether she returned to Octavia's service for another week or sought a different household tomorrow. Nothing she asked of Valentine now could be mistaken for payment. Valentine remained a few paces away. "I nearly bought my peace with your absence 3 nights ago," he said. "I will not make that mistake again." Gwendolyn looked at the blank-backed place card in her hand. The work was over. Tomorrow there would be no guest list between them. No wager. She could call professional, no supper problem that gave her a reason to stand at his side. He would still be the Duke of Edgemont. She would still be Gwendolyn Hawthorne, with wages a reference and no title at all. If she invited him now, there would be no work left to hide behind. She crossed the few paces between them and tapped the ivory card against his palm. "Breakfast," she said, a smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. "You may choose a chair if you are brave enough to lose another argument." Valentine's fingers closed over the card. "I shall sit only where I am invited." The next morning, bright coastal sunlight flooded the small, informal breakfast room. Warm coffee scented the room. Beyond the half-open window came the distant hush of the sea and a gull's cry. There were no place cards, no assigned seating, no guests waiting to judge an arrangement. At the threshold, Gwendolyn paused for half a heartbeat. Nothing in the room required her presence. That was precisely why entering mattered. Valentine stood near the sideboard pouring coffee. He made no move to direct her or seat her. Gwendolyn crossed to the table, bypassed the head and the foot, and selected a chair situated perfectly in the morning sun. She sat down. Then, with a casual hook of her foot, she pulled the heavy wooden chair beside her out from the table. Valentine crossed the room and sat beside her. A silver platter holding the last 2 almond pastries sat between them. As Valentine reached for the slightly larger one, Gwendolyn's hand darted out, snatching it first. "A host is entitled to half Miss Hawthorne," Valentine noted, his dry irony returning effortlessly. "You are off duty, Your Grace," Gwendolyn replied, breaking the pastry unevenly and dropping the smaller piece onto his plate. She gave a quiet, bright laugh that belonged to no one but herself. She had her wages, her reference, and her right to walk out the door. But as the sun warmed the polished wood between them, she knew exactly where she chose to stay. The end.